What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. So today I'm going to be looking at the data from the Limitless online series qualifier 3, which was an Ultra Prism through Rebel Clash standard format tournament with about over 1,200 players entered. This statistic from Arcanine Labs and Limitless says the data includes 1,158 players. I've put this into a sheet and I have some day 2 conversion rates and stuff like that to talk about with you guys, and talk about the popularity of the decks, how many of them made it into day 2, which archetypes were the most successful, kind of what we expected and what we can expect maybe, and just talk about how successful decks were in general. Before we get into that though, shout out to potownstore.com, the best place for you to get ptcgo codes. Use code CELIO for 5% off. And I'd also just like to mention that I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/Celio's Network, where you can get access to my blog posts, articles, early deck lists, things like that. Okay, so these are the graphics provided by Limitless and Arcanine Labs, so definitely thanks to them for putting in this work, making a beautiful pie chart to represent the data. And then all of the numbers and archetypes are down here. They're really small. I have them in a sheet that I'll be showing to you, but this is where I got my data from. So I just wanted to show my source, kind of. And now I did change a few things. So they have Pikachu and Zekrom Boltund decks and other Pikachu and Zekrom decks listed separately. I just combined those into one Pikarom archetype. So I did things like that throughout the sheet. That's just how I would like to look at the data. Maybe other people would like to look at it differently. I also combined Rillaboom and Rillaboom VMAX archetypes into just one archetype to make it a little more neater and look at the data in a little bit of a different way. One thing I could not do here is, so they do have 4 Boltund here, but one of those Boltunds is actually Green's Pikarom. But they listed Green's Pikarom decks as a Boltund deck in the day 1, so I just left that as a Boltund deck in the day 2. And then ADP Greens is a deck down here with just one. It just had one spot in day 2, but it's not listed on the day 1 data, so that was listed as other, so I left that as an other. So when we go to my data, you'll see that there's the other had one deck make day 2, and that was ADP Greens, which was a quad ADP deck. Just 4 ADP. That was the only Pokemon in the deck. You can check all the lists out though on limitlesstcg.com if you're interested in the lists. So this is how I've organized the data. Before we talk about it, I have 2 little things over here on the right. We've got the mean conversion rate of all archetypes and the mean conversion rate of all day 2 archetypes. You can call it success rate, conversion rate, whatever you want. So the conversion rate or success rate, I have it marked as day 2 conversion in column D. That's going to mean how the percentage of players playing that archetype, how many of them made it into day 2 or phase 2, and that's kind of how we're going to measure success. So how successful an archetype was in this tournament will be operationalized as its conversion rate or lack thereof from day 1 to day 2. And of course, you can look at the results on limitlesstcg.com to see what decks actually made top 8, what decks won, things like that. So the mean, in case you don't know, that means the average in lesser terms or more simpler terms. So the average rate that archetypes made day 2, the average conversion rate of all the archetypes in this list, all archetypes listed, is 8.99%. So we could look at that as being the average rate of success. So if a deck did better than that, making it into day 2, it would be deemed successful. If it was less than 8.99, it would be less successful, or below average and above average, however you want to call it. Another one I wanted to do was, this is the average conversion rate of all of the archetypes that made it into day 2. So this top one is all archetypes, so there's a ton of zeros being put into that because of the decks that did not make day 2, the archetypes that did not make day 2. And in this one, it's the conversion rate of only archetypes that made day 2. So there are no zeros in that one. It's ranging from 5.17% up to 50%, which was the highest. So you can choose to use whichever one you want. This one's probably more meaningful to 8.99%, so I'll probably be looking at that as the deck was averagely successful. And also, of course, as we're going through this, if there's just 2 of an archetype, like Excadrill, and one of it made day 2, its 50% success rate really isn't statistically significant because there was only 2 of the archetype. It was a very, very small sample size. Whereas a deck like Pikarom, its results going to be very significant because there were so many players using it. So right here, we just have a frequency distribution looking at how many of the archetypes were in day 1, how many players entered with that archetype into the first phase of the tournament. So we can just start by looking at this. So if you don't include the 5 most popular archetypes were Pikarom, Baby Blacephalon, ADPZ, Dragapult VMAX, and Firebox. Not far behind Firebox is ADP Spiritomb. So Pikarom I consider to be in a popularity tier of its own. 212 was almost, I believe, 16% around of the phase 1 players. So that was really, really high for Pikarom. And then I would say Baby Blacephalon, ADPZ, and Dragapult VMAX are all around the same. I just consider 153, 148, 144. They're not statistically different from each other. There's really no significant difference. So these basically all had the same popularity rate. Yeah, a little less. If you want to say Baby Blounds was 3rd, ADPZ was, I'm sorry, Baby Blounds was 2nd, ADPZ was 3rd, Dragapult VMAX was 4th, but they're all just about the same as each other, give or take a few players. So I do think we kind of got this right on the meta discussion on the channel, where I had Bart and Jay join me to talk about which decks we thought would be popular and which decks we thought would be successful. We were all kind of saying Pikarom and ADPZ would be even with each other, tied for 1st and 2nd in popularity. So that's where we were wrong a little bit. Pikarom actually blew up, with 212 players using it in day 1, and then ADPZ kind of tied for 2nd, 3rd, 4th, I would say, with Baby Blounds and Dragapult VMAX, and then other had 82, and then very far behind in 5th place was Firebox and ADP Tomb, not far behind that, but there's a huge drop between Pikarom and then the next 3, which are Baby Blound, ADPZ, and Dragapult, and then there's another massive drop between these 3 decks and Firebox and ADP Tomb, and then the rest of them. So that's just kind of what we can look at to start predicting for the next tournament. I think Pikarom will go down. It had its hype tournament. Maybe we'll see Dragapult VMAX be the next hype deck. But you can really look at what are articles being written about, what's being featured in YouTube videos, what archetypes are people asking questions about on Facebook and Twitter? What are streamers testing, and what are people watching, and what's their reaction to those decks and lists and archetypes? And you can kind of use that to see what decks you think will be played. So for Pikarom, myself and people I had on the channel and people I talked to and many people around the internet in the community started seeing that Pikarom was doing well in the smaller Discord tournaments like the Sunday Open, which I posted gameplay of on this channel, where Pikarom actually beat me in the finals, and Pikarom was fairly popular and fairly successful. And Cash from Pokestats shared a statistic that was tweeted around that Pikarom was doing well in a lot of like smaller Discord tournaments or league tournaments or whatever you want to call them that are being run during the quarantine. And it was seeing a noticeable uptick in play and success the week leading up to Q3. So there was a lot pointing towards Pikarom being better than expected and having a hype around it. And so you can go down this sheet. I'll leave the link in the description below so you can look at all of this. But I'm kind of focusing on the stuff in the top. We'll look at a couple others as well, though, and then we'll also get into the day 2 conversion rates. So Mewtwo is something that a lot of people had counted off. I originally counted it off myself. But in the days leading up to the tournament, I started talking with some friends and my team that Mewtwo historically has had a really good Pikarom matchup, and even if people don't test it, even if they just take that for what it is, that in excuse me, historically, Mewtwo has had a good Pikarom matchup. Even if they don't test it, that might make people want to play Mewtwo. We saw there were 34 players on Ultimate Mewtwo, 17 players on Mewtwo Welder, and 11 players on Mewtwo Malamar. Not an extravagant amount, but I think potentially more people playing the Ultimate Mewtwo deck than anybody would have guessed. And I think it definitely goes with what I'm saying here, that historically, Ultimate Mewtwo and Mewtwo variants in general are strong against Pikarom. Now, I'm not sure if that's even the case anymore, since Pikarom has Bolt Tund and Pikarom has Speed Energy. Things have changed with Pikarom. But Mewtwo did get play, and the Mewtwo Welder variants were actually fairly successful, which we'll look at in just a moment. When we start talking about the success rates. Zacian v Jirachi Prism and Luke Metal Zacian each had about 30 players on them, which this surprises me a bit for Luke Metal Zacian. Zacian v Jirachi Prism did have a bit of hype around it, so 30 doesn't surprise me too much, but 30 players on Luke Metal Zacian, definitely more than I expected. Obstagoon, which was a last-minute potential meta call for me. I did not expect this many people to be on it, but it did end up turning out to be a really good deck, because if you look at the top decks, Pikarom, Baby Blondes, ADPZ, those decks aren't playing any hard Obstagoon counters. Now, of course, Pikarom has natural counters because it can paralyze. Baby Blondes has Cramorant, so I guess it could try sniping the Pokemon, and it can burn with Blound GX. ADPZ just has nothing to answer it. Dragapult VMAX is weak to Dark. ADP Tomb, again, nothing to answer it. So there was a big reason to play Obstagoon that a lot of people were overlooking, and it's the reason why I was heavily considering it, and I had a lot of friends considering it, and people did play it, and people did do well with it. Cinccino Mill and Sleep Mill, I think there were only 6 Magcargo Mill, which is less than I expected. 26 Cinccino Mill, which is what I expected. I still thought Mill to be good. Not as good, not impressive anymore, but still solid. And then everything else, nothing else really has anything that I wanted to talk about down there. So let's start talking about the conversion rate, the success rate into day 2, which is just taken by looking at how many made it into day 2 and turning that in a percent. And like I said, you can choose to use one or none of these averages that I have over here on the right to help you decide if the deck was very successful, averagely successful, below averagely successful, whatever you want to call it. So these right now we have the sheet sorted by the most spots in day 1. So we'll just keep looking at it by that. So Pikarom had 212 players in day 1. Almost 40 of those players made it into day 2 for an 18% conversion rate. I consider 18% really, really strong. When you have this many players on a deck, that's when the true colors of the deck starts to show. So what 18% is telling me is that it wasn't just hype. The deck actually was very good for this tournament. Baby Blounds is next. So like I said, these 3, I consider them all to be just as popular as one another. Baby Blounds had 153 players on it, 24 made day 2, 15% success rate, a little less than Pikarom, but still very, very strong, 15%, almost 16%. Dragapult VMAX, again, 15% success rate, very good, just like Baby Blounds. ADPZ, however, half of that. ADPZ had roughly the same amount of players, a little less than Blounds, a little more than Dragapult, but only 13 of them made day 2, 8% success rate. So half of Baby Blounds and Dragapult VMAX's success rate, and less than half of Pikarom's success rate. A very poor day for ADPZ. Now, we were talking about this on my stream last night. Plug twitch.tv/Celio's Network. If you don't already follow me, you should do that. We talk about a ton of stuff like this meta analysis and deck lists and whatnot, and I play ptcgo frequently on there. Lots of fun. So if you want to sneak peek at some of this stuff that makes it to YouTube, follow me on Twitch. But so there's a lot of things that can go into this, right? Maybe the people playing ADPZ were overteching their list for one matchup. Maybe they were overteching for Dragapult VMAX, and there was more Pikarom than they expected. Maybe they underteched for Dragapult VMAX, and they didn't have anything to help deal with it. Maybe they weren't prepared for Pikarom. I had a Mew in an ADPZ list, and I was also talking to people about putting Mews into their ADPZ list. I believe I told my patrons the day before. the tournament that I thought Mew could be really good in ADPZ. Because then Pika Rom can't really threaten Tag Bolt, or if they do, then you just drop the Mew and their energy's wasted. So things like that, like maybe the lists weren't optimal, maybe they were teched for the wrong things, maybe the deck just doesn't have as good of a matchup spread as it once did. Maybe Pika Rom's just too aggressive, there's too much Baby Blounds. Dragapult VMAX has a good matchup versus ADPZ when it's not teched for it. So I think maybe the meta is just forming in a way that ADPZ is not as strong. It might not be as oppressive as it was. So especially because Baby Blounds and Pika Rom are one-shot decks, and Dragapult VMAX can match ADPZ's taking extra prizes by taking multiple prizes in a turn. So I know on the meta discussion, I asked the question, is ADPZ going to be solidified in tier 1? Is there any chance of it dropping out of tier 1? And both of my guests we're pretty confident that ADPZ is going to stick around in tier 1. So we'll just have to wait and see. This is just one tournament. It could have been a bad metagame for it. I think it was. There was a lot of Pika, a lot of Baby Blondes, a lot of Dragapult VMAX, a lot of decks that untechted against those. ADPZ, just a vanilla ADPZ list, isn't overly confident against. So we'll have to see how it does in the next one. But ADPZ definitely had a pretty low success rate. According to my average, it would be, according to my average of 8.99, this would be just, it would be about average. It's not really much different than 8.99, 8.78. So it's about average, but ADPZ isn't an about average deck. That's the problem. Looking back at my Sword and Shield format from the International Sword and Shield was first legal for, ADPZ had a really, really high success rate, like Pika Rom does here. Like Baby Blounds does here, like Dragapult VMAX does, and ADPZ just isn't fitting the bill. So let's continue on down the list. Firebox saw 58 players piloting it for phase 1, which is a fair amount, but Firebox has a cult following. People really like Firebox. It didn't do too hot. Firebox isn't a great deck, but it's not the worst. It's had a few players make it into day 2, but it's nothing to write home about. ADP Spirit Tomb did fairly well. 13% success rate. 6 players out of 44 made it in. Pretty good. Now, when we start getting like around 20 or lower, I start thinking a lot less of the success rates because it's a smaller sample size. But as we go down, Ultimate Mewtwo, 5%, some players made it in. Zacian, Jirachi, Prism actually did pretty well. Lucario Melmetal, 9.68%. Now, while this is pretty close to ADPZ's 8.78, which I said wasn't that great for ADPZ, I think this was above expectations for Luke Metal Zacian, and I definitely think this was above expectations for Obstagoon and Chinchino Mill as well. Chinchino Mill had 19%. That's almost 1 for every 5 players. It's basically 1 for every 5 players, 5 out of 26. And then Obstagoon had 1 out of every 6 players that played it made day 2. When you think about it like that, it seems really, really successful. Toxtricity, okay. Bolt Tund, 4 out of 21. We're getting into smaller numbers, which makes them less consistent in my opinion, or less significant in my opinion. Rillaboom, 3 out of 19. Mewtwo Welder, 5 players made it. The success rate of 30%, that's kind of skewed by the low sample size of Mewtwo Welder, but I look at this one more as 5 players out of 17 made it. The success rate, you really can't compare it to Pika Rom, since there was so many Pika Rom players of all skill levels playing it, all kinds of lists playing it, and Mewtwo Welder is much more concentrated. So I think this is a really good showing for Mewtwo Welder, actually, but just don't compare its success rate to something like the top decks that had so like over 100, 200 players on it. You can't really compare, but I do think this had a strong showing, 5 out of 17 players making day 2. And you can go down the list. Like I said, 1 out of 2 Excadrills making day 2. That's great for an Excadrill that it made day 2, but you can't say it had a 50% success rate and Pika Rom only had an 18% success rate. That's asinine to try to compare the two. So like I said, if you want to look at all of this on your own, I'll put this, the link to this sheet in the description down below if you want to check it out. But I always think it's really cool to look at this kind of stuff and talk about success rates and see how many, what the frequency distribution was for day 1 to day 2. and how right everybody was about popularity, and it helps us prepare for the next major tournament. Like I said, you can find these graphics on Limitless's social medias on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, so shout out to Limitless for holding all these tournaments, the sponsors PCA, which was the sponsor for Qualifier 3, and Arcanine for also helping out with all of this. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more content like this in the future, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.